The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Riverside Park. It was one of those quiet Tuesday afternoons when most people were still at work, and the park belonged to retirees, stay-at-home parents, and the occasional jogger. The old man walked slowly along the gravel path, his canvas shopping bag hanging from his right hand. Inside were the usual items: a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, some canned soup, and a pack of cookies he'd bought as a treat for himself. He was 72 years old, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and deep lines etched into his dark brown skin. Those lines told stories of decades lived, hardships endured, and battles fought, both the kind people could see and the kind that stayed hidden behind tired eyes. He wore simple clothes that day: faded jeans, a light blue button-up shirt, and an old jacket that had seen better years. On the left side of that jacket, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a small pin. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but those who knew would understand what it meant. The park was mostly empty. A couple sat on a bench near the pond, sharing sandwiches and quiet conversation. A woman pushed a stroller along the opposite path, her baby fast asleep. Everything felt peaceful, ordinary, like any other day in the neighborhood where the old man had lived for the past 15 years. He liked this park. It reminded him of simpler times, moments when the world felt safe and predictable. But today, that peace wouldn't last. Near the old playground equipment, 3 young men stood in a loose circle, their voices carrying across the open space. They couldn't have been older than 22 or 23, dressed in oversized hoodies and baggy jeans. One of them wore a red cap pulled low over his eyes. Another had headphones around his neck, though no music played. The third kept his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward in that way young men do when they're trying to look tough. They'd been hanging around the park for the better part of an hour, not really doing anything in particular, just talking, laughing too loud, occasionally shoving each other in that rough, playful way that sometimes crosses the line into something else. But when the old man walked past, their attention shifted. The one with the red cap nudged his friend, tilting his head toward the old man. Words were exchanged, too quiet to hear, but accompanied by smirks and knowing glances. Then, almost lazily, they started to follow. The old man noticed, of course. You don't live 72 years, especially not the kind of life he'd lived, without developing a sense for when trouble is brewing. He could feel their eyes on his back, could hear their footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. He didn't speed up or slow down. He just kept walking, his grip tightening slightly on the canvas bag. "Yo, old man," one of them called out. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" He didn't respond. Sometimes when you ignored people like this, they got bored and moved on to something else. But not today. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The voice was closer now, more insistent. The old man could hear them laughing, could sense them picking up their pace. His heart rate stayed steady, though. Not because he wasn't afraid, fear was natural, healthy even, but because he'd learned long ago how to manage it, how to keep it from controlling him. Finally, the 3 young men caught up and spread out in front of him, blocking his path. The one with the red cap seemed to be the leader, or at least the most vocal. He stepped forward with a cocky grin plastered across his face. "Didn't you hear us calling you?" he said, his tone mocking. "That's disrespectful, man. We were just trying to be friendly." The old man stopped walking. He stood there quietly, his expression neutral, his body relaxed but alert. His eyes moved from one face to another, taking in details, assessing the situation. The leader was tall and lean, probably quick on his feet. The second one with the headphones seemed nervous, his weight shifting from foot to foot. The third, the one with his hands in his pockets, had a harder edge to him, his jaw clenched tight. "I don't want any trouble," the old man said finally. His voice was calm, measured. "Just let me pass." This made them laugh. The leader looked back at his friends, shaking his head in disbelief. "You hear this guy? He don't want no trouble." He turned back to the old man, stepping closer. "See, that's good. We don't want trouble either. We just want what's in that bag. And your wallet. Hand them over and you can be on your way." The old man's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not giving you anything. Move aside." The atmosphere shifted. The joking tone evaporated, replaced by something colder. The leader's smile faded. "You think you got a choice, old man? You think because you're old we're just gonna let you walk away?" The second young man, the nervous one, glanced around the park. The couple by the pond had noticed something was happening and were hurrying away. The woman with the stroller had already disappeared down another path. No one wanted to get involved. That's how it always was in situations like this. People saw, people knew, but they looked away. "Last chance," the leader said, his voice dropping lower. "Give us the bag and the wallet." The old man didn't move. He stood there, his canvas bag still hanging from his hand, his feet planted firmly on the ground. To the three young men, his stillness must have looked like fear, like an old body frozen by terror. They'd probably done this before, targeted people they thought were weak, easy marks who wouldn't fight back. But they hadn't looked closely enough. They hadn't noticed the way the old man held himself, the quiet strength in his posture. They hadn't seen the small pin on his jacket, the one that marked him as someone who'd survived things far worse than a confrontation in a park. And they certainly didn't know about the 2 years he'd spent in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where every day was a test of will and survival. In that moment, as the three young men closed in around him, something flickered in the old man's eyes. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something forged in mud and blood and the kind of heat that made grown men weep. It was the recognition that he'd been here before, not in this park, not with these boys, but in moments where survival required action, not hesitation. The leader reached out, his hand moving toward the canvas bag, and that's when everything changed. The old man's free hand moved up slowly, not in surrender but in a subtle defensive position. His breathing stayed controlled. His eyes never left the leader's face. He'd already calculated the distances between them, already mapped out what would happen next if things went the way he suspected they would. "Son," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the leader pause for just a second. "You're making a mistake." But the young man just laughed, and his friends laughed with him. They had no idea what they'd just walked into. The leader's hand wrapped around the canvas bag and yanked hard. The old man's grip was firm, and the bag didn't come free as easily as the young thug expected. For a moment they stood there in a strange tug of war, the worn fabric stretched tight between them. "Let go, old man," the leader snarled, his patience wearing thin, but the old man held on. Not because the groceries inside were so valuable they could be replaced, but because letting go meant accepting what these young men thought he was. Weak, helpless, an easy victim. And he'd spent too many years of his life refusing to be anyone's victim. The second young man, the one with the headphones, moved closer. His nervousness from before had shifted into something else, a kind of eager energy that comes when people realize no one's going to stop them. He reached out and shoved the old man's shoulder, not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to send a message. "You heard him," he said, his voice trying to match his friend's toughness. "Just give it up. You're outnumbered and you're old. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The old man's shoulder absorbed the shove, but he barely moved. His feet stayed planted, his balance perfect. Years of physical work and discipline had left him stronger than he looked. Age had slowed him down, sure, but it hadn't made him fragile. He finally let go of the bag. The leader stumbled backward slightly, surprised by the sudden release. He clutched the canvas bag triumphantly, looking inside at the meager contents, his face twisted in disappointment. "That's it? Milk and bread?" He tossed the bag to the ground, groceries spilling onto the gravel. The milk carton split open, white liquid seeping into the dirt. "What about your wallet? Where is it?" The old man stood perfectly still, his hands now at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was so calm it was almost unnerving. "I'm going to give you one more chance. Walk away now. All three of you. Just turn around and walk away." This seemed to strike the young men as hilarious. The leader threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed across the empty park. The third man, the quiet one who'd been standing back with his hands in his pockets, finally spoke up. "You threatening us?" His voice was cold, flat. Unlike his friends, he wasn't laughing. He pulled his right hand from his pocket, and the afternoon sun caught the edge of something metallic. A knife, not a big one, just a folding blade, maybe 4 inches long. But in situations like this, size didn't matter much. A knife was a knife. He held it loosely, almost casually, letting it catch the light. "Maybe you didn't understand the situation, old man. We're not asking. We're taking. Now give us your wallet, or this gets ugly." A few people had gathered at the far edge of the park now, drawn by the raised voices. An older woman in a floral dress stood near a tree, her hand over her mouth. A man in jogging clothes had stopped mid-run, his phone already out. They were too far away to help, but close enough to see everything that was happening. Some were recording. In today's world, everything got recorded. The old man's eyes fixed on the knife. He'd seen knives before many times in many places. Some of those times he'd been the one holding them. Other times they'd been held against him. Each situation was different, but the basic principles remained the same. Distance was everything. Timing was everything. And fear. Fear could either save you or kill you depending on how you used it. Put that away, the old man said quietly. You don't want to do this. I think I do, the man with the knife replied, taking a step forward. I think you need to understand we're serious. Something shifted in that moment. The old man's posture changed, subtle but significant. His weight redistributed. His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, came up slightly, not in surrender but in readiness. His eyes, which had been tired and somewhat distant, suddenly became sharp and focused. It was like watching a machine power on after years of sitting dormant. The leader noticed the change but misread it. Oh, you think you're tough now? You think because you're standing up straight you're gonna fight three of us? He moved to the old man's right side while his friend with the knife circled to the left. The nervous one with the headphones stayed in front, unsure of what to do, but not wanting to look weak in front of his friends. They were surrounding him now, forming a triangle. It was a basic tactic, one that worked well against most people. When you're surrounded, you can't watch all your attackers at once. You're vulnerable from multiple angles. It was a smart move, really, for street thugs with no formal training. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed the old man would react like a typical victim, panicking, trying to watch all three at once, freezing up. They didn't know that he'd been trained for exactly these scenarios, that he'd spent months learning how to handle multiple attackers, how to position himself, how to move. The old man turned slightly, adjusting his position so that the man with the knife and the leader were both in his line of sight. The nervous one behind him was the least threatening, at least for the moment. Last warning, the old man said. His voice had changed too. It was no longer the gentle tone of a tired senior citizen. It was the voice of someone who'd given orders under fire, someone who'd had to make life or death decisions before most people had finished breakfast. Walk away. The man with the knife lunged forward, not to stab but to intimidate, waving the blade in the old man's face. Or what? What are you going to do, old? He never finished the sentence. The old man's hand shot out faster than anyone expected, certainly faster than the knife wielder could react. His left hand clamped around the young man's wrist like a vice, controlling the weapon hand. At the same time, his right hand struck the inside of the attacker's elbow, a precise blow that sent a shock of pain up the entire arm. The knife clattered to the ground. It happened so fast that the other two young men barely had time to process what they'd seen. 1 second, their friend was threatening the old man with a weapon. The next second, he was yelping in pain, his arm bent at an awkward angle, the knife on the ground between them. The old man released the wrist and stepped back, creating distance again. The man who'd held the knife stumbled away, clutching his arm, his face a mixture of shock and pain. What the leader started, but his voice had lost its confidence. The nervous one with the headphones looked like he wanted to run. His eyes darted between his friend nursing his arm and the old man, who stood there looking like he'd done nothing more strenuous than swat a fly. I told you, the old man said, his breathing still calm and controlled. I told you to walk away, but you didn't listen. You never listen. The woman in the floral dress was talking urgently into her phone now, probably calling the police. The jogger had moved closer, still recording, his face pale but determined to capture everything. The leader looked at his friends, then back at the old man. Pride and anger warred with the cold reality that this wasn't going the way they'd planned. This wasn't some scared old guy they could push around. This was something else entirely. You just made a big mistake, the leader said, trying to salvage some authority. You think because you got lucky once, you can take all three of us? The old man didn't answer. He just stood there waiting, his body relaxed but ready. On his jacket, that small pin caught the fading sunlight. A pin that told a story these young men still didn't understand. They were about to learn. The leader's words hung in the air like a challenge. He was trying to convince himself as much as his friends that they could still win this, that they still had control of the situation. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. The old man said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. He just watched them, his gaze moving from one young face to another, reading their body language, their intentions. The one nursing his sore arm had taken several steps back and wasn't making eye contact anymore. That one was done fighting. The nervous one with the headphones kept glancing toward the park exit, his survival instinct kicking in. That left the leader. And pride, the old man knew, made people do stupid things. You know what? The leader said, pulling himself up to his full height. I'm tired of talking to this old fool. Let's just handle this. He moved forward quickly, more aggressive than calculated, throwing a wild punch aimed at the old man's face. It was the kind of punch you'd see in street fights, all power, no technique. The kind that works when you're fighting someone who doesn't know how to defend themselves. But the old man wasn't that someone. He moved his head just slightly, just enough that the fist sailed past his ear, missing by inches. In the same motion, he stepped to the side and used the attacker's momentum against him. A simple push at the right angle, applied at the right moment, and the leader stumbled forward, his balance completely gone. The old man could have done more. Could have struck him while he was vulnerable. Could have ended it right there. But he didn't. He wasn't trying to hurt these young men. He was just trying to make them understand. The leader caught himself before he fell completely, spinning around with fury in his eyes. He'd been embarrassed now twice in front of his friends, in front of witnesses. That video the jogger was recording would probably be all over social media by tomorrow. The thought of that humiliation made him reckless. Get him, he shouted to his friends. Both of you now. The nervous one hesitated, but the one with the sore arm, perhaps feeling he had something to prove, moved in from the side. Now the old man had two attackers coming at him from different angles. The small crowd watching from the distance gasped. The woman in the floral dress turned away, unable to watch. But the old man's training took over like muscle memory. His body remembered what his mind sometimes tried to forget. Those hot, humid days in boot camp, practicing hand-to-hand combat until his muscles screamed. The hours spent with his unit, learning how to survive close-quarters situations. The real encounters that came later. The ones that weren't practice at all. When you're trained properly, fighting multiple opponents isn't about strength. It's about positioning. It's about making sure you never let them attack you at the same time. It's about controlling the space around you. The old man moved toward the weaker attacker first, the one with the sore arm. This forced that young man to engage before he was ready, while simultaneously putting him between the old man and the leader. Now they couldn't both reach him at once. The young man threw a clumsy punch. The old man deflected it with his forearm, a motion so smooth it looked effortless. Then with a quick movement he grabbed the young man's shirt and used his own momentum to guide him straight into the leader, who was rushing in from behind. The two collided with a heavy thud, tangling together in a confused heap. They weren't seriously hurt, just stunned and disoriented. The old man stepped back again, creating distance, always creating distance. The nervous one with the headphones was frozen now, his hands up in a gesture that was half surrender, half confusion. Man, I didn't sign up for this, he muttered, backing away further. The leader and his friend scrambled to their feet, breathing hard. They were starting to understand now. This wasn't just luck. This wasn't just an old man getting in a few good moves by accident. This was something else entirely. Who are you? The leader asked, genuine confusion mixing with his anger. What are you? The old man's expression softened slightly. I'm someone who's been where you are, young, angry, making bad choices. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, seeing something far beyond this park. But I learned. Sometimes the hard way. You some kind of cop? The one with the sore arm asked, rubbing his elbow. No, the old man said. I'm a veteran. The word landed differently than he expected. The nervous one's eyes widened. Like military? For real? Marines, the old man said simply. 2 tours, Vietnam. There was a moment of silence. Even the leader seemed to process this information, his anger cooling into something more complicated. Everyone had heard stories about Vietnam vets, about what they'd been through, what they'd seen, what they'd had to do. That's what this is about, the leader said, trying to maintain his tough exterior. You think because you were in some war 50 years ago you're better than us? No, the old man said quietly. I think I'm someone who knows what real combat looks like. And this? He gestured at the situation around them. This isn't it. This is just 3 young men making a mistake they're going to regret. In the distance, sirens began to wail. The woman with the phone had gotten through to the police and they were coming. The sound seemed to break whatever remaining fight the three young men had left in them. The nervous one was already walking away quickly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I'm out," he called back to his friends. "This is crazy." The one with the sore arm looked torn, glancing between his fleeing friend and his leader. "Man, the cops are coming. We need to go. Now." But the leader stood there staring at the old man. All the bravado had drained from his face, replaced by something raw and young. For just a moment, he didn't look like a threatening thug. He looked like a kid who'd made a terrible decision and was just now understanding the consequences. "Why didn't you really hurt us?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You could have. I could see it. You held back." The old man picked up his canvas bag from where it had been thrown on the ground. The groceries were ruined, but the bag itself was still good. He'd had it for 20 years, and it would last 20 more. "Because hurting you wouldn't teach you anything," he said, "and because I remember being young and stupid. Most of us were at some point. The question is whether you learn from it." The sirens were getting closer now, maybe a minute away. The leader's friend grabbed his arm. "Come on, we have to go right now." The leader finally moved, backing away, but his eyes stayed on the old man. "I don't understand you," he said. "Maybe someday you will," the old man replied, then they ran. Not with the swagger they'd had when they first approached him, but with the desperate speed of people who knew they'd made a serious mistake. They disappeared around the corner of the park, just as two police cars pulled up to the entrance, their lights flashing red and blue against the late afternoon sky. The old man stood there, his canvas bag in his hand, milk soaking into the gravel at his feet. The jogger was still recording. The woman in the floral dress was hurrying over, talking rapidly about what she'd seen. Other witnesses were coming forward now, eager to give their statements, and the old man felt tired. Not from the physical confrontation, that had barely winded him, but from the memory of all the times in his life when violence had been necessary, when there'd been no choice but to fight. He'd hoped those days were behind him. The police officers approached, their hands resting cautiously near their belts, not sure yet what they were walking into. "Sir," the first officer said, a young woman with her hair pulled back tight. "We got a call about an assault. Are you all right?" The old man looked down at his jacket, at the small pin that had been there all along, the pin these young thugs never bothered to notice. He touched it briefly with his finger, a habit he'd developed over the years. "I'm fine, officer," he said, "but I think we need to talk." The two police officers listened carefully as the old man explained what had happened. He kept his account simple and straightforward, leaving out nothing. The attempted robbery, the knife, the way he'd defended himself. He didn't try to make himself sound heroic or the young men sound worse than they were. He just told the truth. The female officer took notes while her partner, an older man with gray at his temples, watched the old man with a curious expression. When the story was finished, the older officer spoke up. "Sir, you said you disarmed one of them? The one with the knife?" "Yes, officer. And you held off 3 attackers without getting injured?" The old man nodded. "I didn't want to hurt them, just wanted them to stop." The older officer's eyes drifted down to the pin on the old man's jacket. He leaned in slightly, squinting to read it. When he recognized what it was, his entire demeanor changed. He straightened up and his voice took on a tone of respect. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Marines. 1967 to 1971. The officer extended his hand and the old man shook it. "My father was in Vietnam, 1st Cavalry Division. He never talked much about it. Most of us don't," the old man said quietly. By now, several witnesses had gathered around, all eager to tell the police what they'd seen. The jogger showed the officers his phone video, and even from where the old man stood, he could hear the shocked reactions as they watched the footage. The woman in the floral dress kept repeating that the old man had been absolutely amazing, and that those hoodlums had no idea who they were messing with. The female officer looked up from her notebook. "Sir, we're going to need you to come to the station to make an official statement. But from what we're seeing and hearing, this was clearly self-defense. You should be commended, not questioned." "I just did what I had to do," the old man said. Nothing more. A small crowd had formed now. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that something significant had happened at the park. People who'd been inside their homes were coming out to see what all the commotion was about. Some recognized the old man. He'd lived on Maple Street for 15 years, always kept to himself, always polite but never particularly social. An elderly man with a cane pushed through the small gathering. He lived 2 houses down from the old man, and they'd exchanged hellos over the years, but never much more than that. "I heard what happened," the neighbor said, slightly out of breath. "Is it true? You fought off 3 men trying to rob you?" The old man felt uncomfortable with all the attention. It wasn't really a fight, just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. "A misunderstanding?" The jogger spoke up, still holding his phone. "Sir, I got the whole thing on video. You were incredible. Where did you learn to move like that?" Before the old man could answer, the older police officer intervened. "He's a Vietnam veteran, Marines." The reaction was immediate. Faces in the crowd changed from curious to respectful. Some people nodded knowingly. Others looked at the old man with new eyes, suddenly seeing past the gray hair and the worn jacket to something deeper. A younger man in his 30s stepped forward. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. He passed away 5 years ago, but he always said the Marines were the toughest of the tough." He looked at the old man with genuine admiration. "Thank you for your service, sir." The old man accepted the thanks with a quiet nod, but he could feel the weight of all these eyes on him. He'd never wanted this kind of attention. His military service was something he'd carried privately, a chapter of his life that belonged to him and the men he'd served with. Some of those men hadn't made it home. Thinking about them always made his chest feel tight. The female officer's radio crackled to life. She stepped away to respond, and when she came back, she had news. "We've got units searching the area for the 3 suspects. Based on witness descriptions and the video footage, we should be able to identify them. The one who dropped the knife left fingerprints on it." She looked at the old man. "We'll need that video evidence from everyone who recorded this incident. And sir, you'll definitely need to come down to the station." "Of course," the old man said. "Whatever you need." As the female officer started collecting contact information from witnesses, the older officer pulled the old man aside slightly, away from the crowd. "Can I ask you something?" The officer said, his voice low. "When those men came at you, were you scared?" The old man considered the question carefully. "Fear is always there. It's what you do with it that matters. I learned that a long time ago." The officer nodded slowly. "My dad used to say something similar. He'd have nightmares sometimes, even decades after he came home. But when I asked him if he was brave over there, he said, being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant doing what needed to be done anyway." "Your father was a wise man," the old man said. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, 2 men connected by the invisible thread of military legacy. Then the officer's radio called him away, and the old man was left standing alone in the middle of the park, surrounded by people but feeling separate from them somehow. The woman in the floral dress approached him, carrying something in her hands. She'd gathered up the spilled groceries from his canvas bag, the ones that hadn't been completely ruined. "I saved what I could," she said, handing him the bread, which was only slightly squashed, and a couple of cans. "The milk was a total loss, I'm afraid." "Thank you," the old man said, accepting the items. "That's very kind." "Kind?" She shook her head firmly. "It's the least anyone could do. What you did today, standing up to those thugs, defending yourself, that took real courage. This neighborhood needs more people like you." The old man didn't know how to respond to that. He'd never thought of himself as particularly courageous. He'd just been someone trying to get home with his groceries. More neighbors kept arriving, and with them came more questions. Where had he learned to fight like that? How long had he been in the military? Had he ever been in actual combat? The questions made him uncomfortable, but he answered them as best he could, keeping his responses brief. One question came from a teenage boy who'd been watching from across the street. "Were you scared they might hurt you? I mean, you're, older." The old man smiled slightly at the boy's careful wording. "Age is just a number, son. What matters is what you've learned along the way. Those young men today, they relied on intimidation and numbers. They thought that would be enough. But it wasn't," the boy said, his eyes wide. "No, it wasn't, because they made the mistake of judging me by what they saw on the outside. They saw an old man and assumed that meant weak. They didn't look any deeper than that." A woman standing nearby spoke up. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, and I never knew you were a veteran." "You never mentioned it?" The old man shrugged. "It's not something I talk about much. A lot of us don't." "Why not?" someone else asked. You should be proud of your service. I am, the old man said carefully. But pride doesn't mean you have to advertise it. The men I served with, the ones who didn't make it home, they can't talk about their service. So I carry it quietly for them. The crowd fell silent at that. It was a perspective many of them hadn't considered before. The older police officer returned, gesturing to his patrol car. Sir, if you're ready, we can take you down to the station now. Shouldn't take more than an hour or so to get your statement processed. The old man nodded and followed the officer toward the car. As he walked, neighbors patted him on the shoulder or called out words of encouragement. The jogger promised to send his video to the police right away. The woman in the floral dress said she'd check on him later to make sure he was all right. Just before he got into the police car, the old man turned back to look at the park. The spot where it had all happened looked so ordinary now. Just another patch of gravel path. Nothing to indicate that anything significant had occurred there. In a few days, people would walk past that spot without giving it a second thought, but the old man would remember. He'd remember the look in those young men's eyes when they realized they'd made a mistake. He'd remember the weight of having to use skills he'd hoped he'd never need again, and he'd remember the way the community had come together afterward. Strangers becoming neighbors, all connected by a single moment of truth. As the patrol car pulled away from the park, the old man caught one last glimpse of the crowd. They were still standing there, talking among themselves, probably already turning the incident into a story they'd tell others. He just hoped those 3 young men were somewhere learning their own lessons from today. Because if they were smart, if they had any sense at all, they'd realize how lucky they were. Lucky that they'd run into someone who knew how to fight but chose mercy instead. 3 days after the incident at the park, the old man's life had become something he didn't quite recognize. His phone, which usually rang maybe once a week, had been buzzing constantly. The local newspaper wanted an interview. A television news station had left 3 messages. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to in 15 years were knocking on his door, bringing casseroles and cookies, wanting to hear the story firsthand. He'd given his statement to the police that first evening, and it had been straightforward. The video evidence from multiple witnesses made everything clear. Self-defense, pure and simple. The 3 young men had been identified through the fingerprints on the knife and were now facing charges for attempted robbery and assault. The district attorney's office had called to tell him he might need to testify if the case went to trial. But that wasn't what was keeping the old man up at night. He sat on his front porch on Saturday morning, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the neighborhood wake up. A car drove by slowly, the driver craning their neck to look at his house. Word had spread far beyond just the people who'd been at the park. The story had made the local news, and suddenly everyone knew about the Vietnam veteran who'd defended himself against 3 attackers. The attention made him deeply uncomfortable. He'd lived quietly for so long, content to be invisible, just another face in the neighborhood. Now people were calling him a hero, and that word sat heavy on his shoulders. Real heroes, the ones he'd known, were buried in places far from here. A car pulled up in front of his house, one he didn't recognize. For a moment he tensed, old instincts kicking in. But when the driver got out, the old man relaxed. It was the older police officer from the park, the one whose father had served in Vietnam. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, sir," the officer said, walking up the path to the porch. "I'm off duty. Just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up with all this attention." The old man gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Coffee's on if you want some." "I'm good, thanks." The officer sat down, and for a moment they both just looked out at the quiet street. "I heard the news stations have been hounding you." "They have. I don't want to talk to them. What happened was it was just something that happened. I don't see why everyone's making such a big deal about it." The officer smiled slightly. "With respect, sir, most 72-year-old men couldn't do what you did. And the way you handled it, controlled, precise, minimal force, that's not just luck. That's training. That's discipline. People are inspired by that." The old man shook his head. "They shouldn't be inspired by violence." "They're not," the officer said gently. "They're inspired by courage, by someone who stood up for himself when he had every reason to be afraid. That means something, especially these days." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then the officer cleared his throat. "There's another reason I came by. Those 3 young men. They were arraigned yesterday. The judge set bail, but here's the interesting part. The leader, the one who started the whole thing, he asked his public defender if there was any way he could talk to you. The old man turned to look at the officer.
Talk to me, why?
His lawyer says he's been having some kind of crisis of conscience. Apparently what you said to him in the park about being young and making mistakes, it stuck with him. He wants to apologize. He can apologize in court if he wants, the old man said. I know, and I told his lawyer you'd probably say that, but I promised I'd pass along the message anyway. The officer stood up, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, the kid seems genuinely shaken up. Maybe you got through to him in a way the system never could. After the officer left, the old man sat there thinking. He'd seen plenty of young men make bad choices in his life. Some learned from those choices. Others didn't. He wondered which category these three would fall into. The next surprise came on Sunday afternoon. The old man was in his backyard, working in the small vegetable garden he kept when he heard voices from the front of the house. He walked around to find a group of about 15 people gathered on his lawn. Some were wearing military service caps, Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines. Veterans like him, an older black woman in an Army cap stepped forward, extending her hand. We heard about what happened. We wanted to come by, pay our respects to a fellow veteran. The old man shook her hand, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, said a white-haired man with a Marine Corps cap. We just wanted you to know you're not alone. A lot of us came home from our wars and tried to blend in, tried to be invisible, but what you did the other day reminded folks that we're still here, that we still have something to offer. They stayed for an hour, sharing stories and coffee on his front lawn. Some had served in Vietnam like him. Others had been in Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different wars, different eras, but all connected by the experience of service. The old man found himself relaxing, talking more freely than he had in years. These people understood. They didn't need him to explain or justify. They just knew. When they finally left, they invited him to attend the next meeting of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. We meet every Thursday evening, the woman in the Army cap told him. Good group of people. You'd be welcome any time. The old man promised he'd think about it, and he meant it. On Monday morning, he received a call from the county jail. The public defender for the leader of the three young men was asking once again if he'd be willing to meet with her client. The old man surprised himself by saying yes. 2 days later, he sat in a small conference room at the jail waiting. The door opened and a young man in an orange jumpsuit shuffled in, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked different than he had in the park. Smaller somehow. Younger. Without the bravado and the backup of his friends, he was just a scared kid facing serious consequences. They sat across from each other, a guard standing by the door. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, the young man broke the silence. I don't really know what to say. My lawyer thought this was a good idea, but now that I'm here... He trailed off, looking down at his hands. Why did you want to see me? The old man asked. Because I can't stop thinking about what you said. About being young and stupid and making mistakes. About learning from them. He looked up and there were tears in his eyes. I've been in and out of trouble since I was 14. Nothing serious, just small stuff. But this is serious. I could go to prison for years. You could, the old man agreed. You pulled a knife on someone. You tried to rob them. Those are serious crimes. I know that now. But in the moment I wasn't thinking. He struggled for words. My friends and I, we thought we were tough. We thought we could take whatever we wanted. But you weren't scared of us. Even when we had you surrounded, even when there was a knife, you weren't scared. And then afterward, when you could have really hurt us, you didn't. Why? The old man leaned back in his chair. Because hurting you wouldn't have accomplished anything except making me feel powerful for a moment. And I've seen enough violence in my life to know it doesn't solve problems. It just creates new ones. You were in Vietnam, right? The war? Yes. Did you have to hurt people over there? The old man's eyes grew distant. I did what I had to do to survive and to protect the men serving beside me. War is different, but even in war, you carry those choices with you for the rest of your life. Every single one. The young man absorbed this. I'm sorry, he said finally. For what we did. For threatening you, for trying to rob you. You didn't deserve that. Nobody does. No, they don't, the old man said. But apologies are just words. What matters is what you do next. You've got a choice to make. You can let this define you, or you can let this change you. I don't know if I can change. I've been this way for so long. The old man stood up slowly. I was 18 when I joined the Marines. Angry kid from a rough neighborhood, no real direction in life. The Corps taught me discipline, taught me what I was capable of when I pushed myself. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to quit. But I didn't, and it changed everything. He moved toward the door, then paused. You're what, 22? 23? Your life isn't over. It's barely started. But you're at a fork in the road. One path leads to more of this. He gestured at the jail around them. And the other path leads to something better. Only you can choose which way to go. The young man nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. Thank you for coming. You didn't have to. No, I didn't. But maybe someday, when you're older and someone younger makes a mistake, you'll remember this conversation. And maybe you'll give them the same chance I'm giving you now. As the old man left the jail and stepped out into the afternoon sunshine, he felt something shift inside him. For years, he'd kept his past locked away, thinking it was better to forget. But maybe that had been wrong. Maybe his experiences, both the good and the terrible, had value. Maybe they could help others avoid the mistakes he'd made, or the mistakes he'd seen others make. His phone buzzed. It was a text from the woman in the army cap, reminding him about the VFW meeting on Thursday. He typed back a simple reply, I'll be there. The old man walked to his car feeling lighter than he had in years. The world was still complicated, still full of people making bad choices.